considering what we're seeing on ground, the devastation from the videos and the reality coming across each province for this flood, yes, it absolutely is an emergency situation. But declaring it as an emergency, does that unlock anything internationally? Unfortunately, no. The climate financing systems are not designed to be unlocked if a country, either its national cabinet or the government in a parliament, declares that there's an emergency in their country, depending on the disasters that are being seen on ground. In the case of Pakistan, for example, the funds are designed very differently, where they don't trigger if there is a humanitarian crisis. We always have seen whenever there has been let's put climate to aside for a second. Disasters happen. Disasters have been happening where migrations and things have happened. There have been conflicts in our area where humanitarian assistance has always been coming through very openly into this country. But unfortunately, climate finance has to go through a process of proposal development, of a clear case for how you're supporting or how you're going to try and avoid a climate disaster in the future if this money is used properly. So I'm glad that there's an emergency declared, which means the people on ground, I am assuming, will be helped more swiftly by the system. But this does not translate into money coming into Pakistan from international funding opportunities. So Pakistan there are funding opportunities which through time have developed. So think of it this way. Earlier on in the early, say, for example, when this whole climate conversation started, it really started with we need to reduce our carbon footprints. We need to reduce the carbon emissions that the developed countries are doing. And I'm talking about when science started, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, started talking about the fact that climate is being caused by the carbon emissions. So people started focusing on mitigation, that we need to reduce our carbon emissions. But then the reality started showing in countries like Pakistan that no matter how much if you hypothetically reduced your mitigation to zero today, it will still have an impact. Disasters will still happen in countries, and then you need to be able to adapt to it. And then things like the Adaptation Fund and then now the Green Climate Fund have come through, where we realize that we need to help, we need to have the funding opportunities to be able for countries like Pakistan to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which means better preparedness, which means looking at risk reduction options, which also means calling a spade, where we want to make sure that whatever development we're doing in the countries with our own money, domestic capital that we have, has a climate lens and has the technical lens to make sure that wherever we're spending our money has a climate angle to it. And of course, there is the additional adaptation support that you get from the international funding mechanisms. And then, since this was happening, regardless of the adaptation that people were doing, and yes, Pakistan has been able to tap into some of this, but of course, it's been piecemeal, it's been projectized. So one project here, one project there. You'll have different international agencies thinking about a couple of districts, so they will go and take those districts. But guess what? The flood has come in some other districts. So nobody has really thought of this as a programmatic approach in which you as a country sit down and think, okay, here are the 5 funding opportunities. Here are the 10 hotspots for flood or for a drought or for sea level rise. How do I connect my problem to which funding opportunity? So that's the scale that we require to actually tap into the resources that you need. And then coming back to the fact that, okay, TK, we're trying to adapt to it, but the reality is that floods are still happening. And the concept of loss and damage emerged, which meant we're adapting to it. We're doing all those things we should be doing. But when a disaster comes, it just wipes everything away. And if you recall, Pakistan, I think, played a really good role in back in 2022 when they got the International Loss and Damage Fund established. We were chairing the G77 at that time within the COP negotiations, so we were able to achieve that. Now, that fund is in the process of getting operationalized. So now when it's getting operationalized, that means there will be funding opportunities that we can tap into, where countries like Pakistan and others have been pushing for the concept of, should a disaster happen, how do you support us immediately? So we can't sit and write proposals when a flood or a disaster has happened, but what's the contingency that we have in the system that we're able to access it? We haven't reached there yet. So even the loss and damage fund is still looking at, let's talk about how you will design, how you will write proposals and all of those things. So, you're dealing with a negotiation process in which, you get some, you lose some, but this is this is how the system is in terms of how the funds have evolved, and how Pakistan needs to evolve with understanding what those opportunities are and align them with your problems from a more holistic perspective, rather than this project or that project that Pakistanis usually count, or 300 million have come from this fund, or that million have come from that fund, and there's nothing happening on ground. We're still, in the eye of the storm. But that's because nobody is looking at it holistically. That statement is absolutely so let's unpack the pledge first. The pledge in 2022 through the Geneva conference after the flood happened was $9.6 billion. So this was your World Bank, this was your ADB, and this was your bilateral countries coming in to say. But nobody really read the fine print. What did it say? It said subject to funding proposals, subject to feasibility studies, subject to technical calculation, the whole spiel that you need to be able to take your case. And we never did that. So right now, I think Aurangzeb Saab, our finance minister, also mentioned a week or so ago that we were not able to materialize these pledges. I think $1 billion or so have come in. That's because when you look at the package, one, it had a fine print, and two, some of these, so the funding, our financial friends, they had some projects already in the pipeline with Pakistan. So they sort of put all of those together and said, look, that's the amount I'm pledging to your flood support at that time, right? So it's important to not just go by big numbers and say, oh, 2022, we had $9.6 billion. Where did that go? It came with conditions similar to the conditions that the IMF RSF is coming with, right? The Resilience Support Fund that we were very excited about earlier in the year, where IMF has released $1.3 billion. If you look at the document, it has very clear climate reforms that you need to initiate as a country. Similar to other reforms they always ask us to do before they release any of the tranches. So it's important to understand that if a doctor suggests some medicine, we take the medicine to be able to really change things around, rather than, going for short-term solutions. So I would like to answer this question in two parts. Pakistan sees a trickle. I think I would refer to my previous answer, which primarily explains how these funding opportunities work. So you need to understand the access game, right? It's important to understand what do you need in a proposal and how do you need to access it. Just to think that you're vulnerable, I hear everyone talk about the fact that Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries. We don't emit, yet nobody gives us any funding. Nobody helps us. It's not that nobody wants to help you. You need to help yourself first, right? So the money that you're spending, first of all, let's be conscious of how you need to spend that, number one. Number two, you need to understand the access. The trickle is because you don't know how to access it. People are not sitting out there and saying, hey, Pakistan, here, go ahead and use this money because you're so vulnerable. You have to make a case because you're one of the 150 or 160 countries in the world who need the money. Look at what's been happening this year across the globe. Every single country has been flooded. Some are rich enough to have the capacity to cope with it, and some are not rich enough, and they have to deal with the impacts of loss and damage. That's my answer number one. My answer number two is, when you talk about debt burden, let's understand the difference between standard development finance and climate finance. The problem is we've been used to getting grants as a country for too long. So we need development support for education, for health. You have the Bill and Melinda Gates, you have all these foundations doing excellent philanthropy in the country, and you get used to it as opium. So you have a $50 million, you have a $200 million program running in the country, which is just grant support. So you're so used to it as a country that everything you get will have no strings attached to it. To climate finance, which if you look at it from numbers perspective, the only 18% globally, as of, I was looking at the figures, the latest figures haven't been published as yet, but this is from 2023, 18% of it goes to adaptation. The remaining goes to mitigation. So mitigation means think about improving, your energy mix, think about energy efficiency, think about e-mobility, think about all those elements that Pakistan under the garb of, oh, we are not mitigation, we are not emitting, so why should we mitigate, without realizing that there's a proper economic business case in engaging on the remaining mitigation funding that's available internationally, where you don't have a grantee recipient relationship, you actually have a partnership on the table. So let's not think about debt burdening. Let's put that to a side. Let's really think about climate finance where there's equity, or there is guarantee that's available to you. There's various insurance instruments that are available internationally. There's the capital markets, there's pension funds that are willing to invest in your climate solutions. So we really need to, yes, secure and make sure that the floods and the disasters are carefully catered for, not in terms of once the flood has come, so we need to have better relief and rehabilitation, but really better risk reduction and then better preparedness so that there's lesser pressure on your, so you try and make sure that you don't change every flood into a disaster, right? And they say, generally, if you look at the figures, that $1 spent in preparedness will save you 6 or 10 in disaster relief and rehabilitation, right? So it's a very good return on investment if you think of it that way. So there is that piece where you want to make sure that you spend smartly domestically, because the adaptation financing or the grant financing is next to nothing internationally. What you really need to move into is a special place when it comes to climate finance, where the young people in this country, the entrepreneurs, coming up with ideas that can solve global problems when it comes to climate change. There is carbon capture and storage that the Gulf countries are very interested in, because they don't want to reduce their emissions. They just want to try and create technologies that will actually remove the carbon from the air. There's so many different technologies and different creative ways in which we could think of solutions. For that, there is equity available. There are various financial instruments available out there where you try and use the climate money so smartly that you create, you support the economy, your own economy out of it. We have it, right? So, I mean, we could be saying that you could have asked me this question in 2022, and I would have said, yes, there's a realization, and, people are, there's strings attached to the money that other people, the international entities are releasing to say, get your house in order from a regulatory perspective, from a governance perspective, to make sure that the damages are minimized when floods come through, really on the preparedness piece. But unfortunately, here we are 3 years later, and you're having to ask me the same question. Just goes to show that we have short-term memory loss, I think. Because 2022 was not very far away, right? If we compared it to the 2010 floods, chalo theek hai, people, 2022, yes, there were provincial floods in between, but a national catastrophe was not what we had seen for 12 years. So I can, people get lazy, or people think, why should we spend so much money on a flood or dikes, or create infrastructure which is not going to be good value for money, right? So if a flood comes once in 12 years, why should we spend that kind of money once in whatever number? But here you are, 3 years. Now, that's the problem with climate change, which you can't predict the frequency and the magnitude and the timing of the next disaster, right? So then you're in a situation where it's a blind bluff, right? So you don't know. Yes, we know monsoons have been every single year since the past thousands of years. Monsoons have been part of the subcontinent. Summer, we know exactly when they come. We know exactly how the rivers flow through the length of our country. We know exactly what millimeter of rain happens. Now those are turning into flash floods. Those are turning into riverine floods. Those are turning into, obviously, upstream. Whatever happened with India, they had to release because there's people being flooded over there as well. So long answer to a short question, but the reality is I don't see that tipping point or the level of seriousness in understanding the problem we're facing. So if I go out and say things like, we should access international funding in August of 2025, and then I forget about my statement because September comes with new challenges, new political turmoil, and then come June 2026, and I'm saying the same spiel again, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not predicting that there'll be another flood next year, but what preparedness have you done? Mhm. The one change, the tipping point that I was mentioning, so the only difference that I'm seeing between messaging from our government from 2022 and 2025 really is 2022 was all about come help us, international appeal, right? To at least 3 years later, where you're talking about a potential roadmap to say, oh, what do we need to do and where can international community help? Rather than saying, come help us, give us the money and we're going to literally, pay people in making their houses or get them food while they wait for their houses or whatever to be built back in the same places that they were. Um, uh, uh, the roadmap, as I said earlier, needs to have all the elements of matching what opportunities are available internationally. I spoke about some funding opportunities and what they like to fund. So the loss and damage fund is very different than the Green Climate Fund, is very different than what the IMF is telling you, is very different than what the World Bank is telling you. So listen to what is being said and then match that to your problems on ground. You know exactly, your primary problem is flooding, right, at this stage. Then, of course, you have a drought issue. What all does it relate? What does it translate into, right? So you have a Living Indus initiative that the Ministry of Climate Change put together a few years ago, which really talked about what are the 20 or 22 interventions we need to do to ensure that the Indus continues to be alive and kicking to help this region in the world prosper, right? So you have these things that you have done in bits and pieces, but the problem is that we think the world starts with where we want it to start. By that I mean we will take a two-pager for a possible request and say this is what we need money for, without really looking at whether there are structures, there are systems in place, whether your request actually matches what they provide funding for. So to think, oh, we had a flood and you need to help us in this province or that province, nobody's listening to you anymore.